nice to be with you again. Don't know how much mic would you like here?
Well, if you just leave it, it'll be
Probably fine. I'm used to talking to larger groups than this in lecture halls as a rule, but it's nice to have 30 people who listen to you as opposed to 250 who won't. So that's a pleasant relief, at least. I was here a year ago, and we talked about Blue Mound Road. It was part of the series on local history that was done with John Gerda and other visiting authors. And I enjoyed it very much, so I'm happy to have the opportunity to come back and speak with you again. It's a little different this evening, though. My research on Blue Mound Road made me more or less a local expert on that topic. In this area, this is just one of a number of areas of local history that I've had a certain interest in over the years, but I'm certain there are people here that have aspects of this story that I do not know, especially since I'm told we have some folks here who had friends or family members who were actually members of the Metropolitan Church Association. So I'm certain there are some stories there that I probably can't compete with on a personal level. But I understand also that this is a part of your work on a book project. You have a book club which is reading The Giver, and some of those involved in that are researching and thinking about the idea of utopia. And I think that's a worthy topic to consider, because the concept of a utopia on earth is a very American idea. Don't think for a minute that the Burning Bush movement in Waukesha was in any way unique. It had its unique characteristics, but it was one of a number of manifestations of people who wanted to create a perfect place, a place that would purify them from the wrongs and the shortcomings of this world we live in. And that's something I think to some extent or other we can all relate to. Certain of these utopia movements blossomed around the country at the turn of the century and slightly before. A marvelous book was authored probably about 10 years ago by a woman by the name of Shirley Nelson. The book is entitled Fair, Clear, and Terrible: The Story of Shiloh. It is about a very similar organization. The similarities are eerie. Even the architecture is similar. Only this particular group was in Shiloh, Maine, which was actually a religious commune founded near the tiny town of Lisbon Falls in 1896. It was founded by a dynamic young preacher by the name of Frank Weston Sanford. Sanford wanted to prepare the world for the second coming of Christ, but he needed to do that in a certain way. He needed a band of holy followers whose lives were completely committed to the idea of holiness, to the concept of purification of the individual and separation from the sins of the world. The local folk were not pleased to see him arrive in Lisbon Falls, a story we will see repeated in Waukesha. When he held his first meetings, hoping to begin construction of the complex that would become his religious commune, the local folks would hoot and holler and try to interrupt his meetings in town, even walking up and down the wooden staircase outside the meeting hall, stomping and clomping their feet so that nothing could be heard inside. When he announced he would have a baptismal ceremony in the town river, local hooligans got there before him and stuffed the hole that he had cut in the ice. True believers baptized in the middle of winter, I should imagine, and stuffed the hole with brush and debris so that they had to cut another hole in the ice in order to conduct their baptisms. Shiloh was a typical religious commune. Everyone who joined had to surrender all of their material possessions, all of their earthly wealth as they went in the door. They literally signed over their fortunes, their possessions, their inheritance to the operators of Shiloh. If they decided later they'd made a mistake and wished to leave, they left with nothing but the shirt on their back. The agreement was a contract drawn up by the group's attorneys, and it was legally binding. You did not leave with what you came in with. Frank Weston Sanford died in March of 1948, but not before leaving a legacy. He told his followers, "Shiloh will not be for everyone, only for the fair, clear, and terrible." Well, the religious communes across the country could say a similar thing. I'm going to quote briefly from this book by way of concluding my introduction. In one particular talk, Sanford discussed prayer and how to come closer to God. There is a threatening downside to the prospect. They could expect appalling consequences if they murmured or complained, as had followers of Moses in the Sinai. Quote, "He wants you to be so true to God that there will not be the slightest pity or mercy shown to the man, woman, or child in this place who is not absolutely true to God. He wants you to be so true that you will take God's part against yourself, against the whole Bible school, wherever there is sin. He wants you to be so real, so absolutely uncompromising in your antagonism to sin, just as real as if you were to take a sword and drive it through the bowels of your son, your wife, as real as if you were to slay your father, your mother, your brother, your sister, or even yourself. You are actually to hate, with a perfect hatred, your father, mother, brother, sister, child, and even your own life, insofar as these are not in conformity with the Word of God." Sanford says it far better than I could. His remarks relate to the separation between those inside the closed community and those on the outside. Utopian movements are not alien to American history. They have a number of things in common, but the most obvious thing they all hold in common, they all die out. They all fade away. A colleague of mine, with whom I taught at UWM a number of years ago, took a trip to the Far East, and there he encountered the remnants of a monastery, once bustling with young monks, now manned by only 4 elderly survivors. There was no one joining the order any longer, and he asked them the obvious question: was your life a failure? Well, no, they said, but the Lord is not using us any longer. He has something else in mind. Perhaps that is the only way that members of such dying utopian societies can console themselves, but ultimately the dream comes to an end. And it's a very old dream and uniquely American. I can trace it back to you for as far as this country has history. In 1620, the arrival of the Mayflower. In 1630, the arrival of the Puritans in Boston. The early Puritans and Pilgrims were separatists. They wished to separate themselves from the world and from the worldly ways of the Church of England. And they came to the wilderness to carve out a new society in peace. Not a society of total religious freedom, but a society in which they could mold the social structures to fit their own interpretations of religious scripture. Well, ultimately, the Puritan dream was shattered by the Salem witch trials and by other happenings of colonial New England. It finally split in the 1740s during the period of the Great Awakening into 2 movements. One intellectual, which evolved into Unitarianism, and the other emotional, which evolved into the camp meeting fervor of the New Light movement that stressed an emotional reliance upon God. The Burning Bush movement of Waukesha is a spiritual heir to the latter half of that colonial split. There were other groups who attempted to build utopian societies. Those of you who love furniture may be familiar with the Shakers because of their marvelously utilitarian furniture creations, which some people have in their homes. The Shakers were a religious society that formed communal groups living outside of the social structure of mainstream America. They rejected sex. They repudiated intercourse as a means of propagating or continuing the race. Ultimately, they died out. In interviews with the final surviving Shakers, they seem to have some confusion as to exactly how that occurred. Many of us could have told them, but nonetheless, their movement also failed, and the properties which they had held in trust for generations now have been turned over to local historical societies, which preserve many of them for people to come and see even today. There are not only religious communes, however. I would neglect my topic tonight were I not to mention the fact that some communal societies are also political. The most notable of them was a group founded by Job Harriman called the New Llano Colony back in 1917. He called it a cooperative commonwealth, and it was located in Antelope Valley, California. When he found out there wasn't sufficient water supply for the 1,100 settlers who'd been attracted to the region, he moved them to 19,000 acres of land, which he purchased in the small town of Staples, Louisiana, sold to him by the Gulf Lumber Company of St. Louis for $150,000, payable on easy terms. That may not surprise you until you find out that Job Harriman was a socialist who was the 1900 vice presidential running mate of Eugene Victor Debs, the longtime Socialist Party candidate for the presidency. Harriman explained that socialists in politics did not seem to fare especially well, at least not outside of the city of Milwaukee, and he suggested this, quote, "I came to the conclusion that we should have to add economic activities to our political activities or we should never succeed," unquote. So the point was to found a political commune built along socialist lines of egalitarianism and sharing of the wealth. The history of the commune was not pretty. The socialists had a firm concept of private property and did not care to share. The history of the New Llano colony was marked by jealousy, factionalism, and even open revolution, according to Frank O'Hare, a former member. It finally was bankrupt by 1939. In our area, the most famous, or some would say infamous, of these communal societies actually came along a little bit later. And that, of course, was the Heaven City community located out in Mukwonago on what is now National Avenue. The last member of that community, Shirley Talcott, died in 1978 and evidently had left the property to two restaurateurs who had been running it under her direction. She was promptly sued, or her estate was sued, by other survivors of former commune members who wanted their share of their input back. The Heaven City group was often called a love cult, which was probably a bit exaggerated, but the fact that men and women lived together communally in a time as early as 1923 gave rise to certain suspicions among the neighbors. It was started by A.J. Moore, who started building a following in Chicago, and in 1923, 45 people signed over all that they had, their bank accounts, their homes, all of their earthly wealth, to A.J. Moore. He used the money to purchase a 130-acre piece of property in Harvard, Illinois, and he told them, if you leave us, you leave all of your contributions behind. During the Depression, they found themselves unable to make mortgage payments on the property. For want of $600, they were evicted by the sheriff and forced to relocate to their location in Mukwonago. Ultimately, they went into the hotel and restaurant business, realizing that the locals had a fascination with what was going on there, and eventually they had a number of curiosity seekers stop for lunch and dinner. A.J. Moore died in 1963. His son, Ed Moore, by the way, was the town assessor for years for the town of Mukwonago. Well, now to bring it to the topic closer at hand, and that's the city of Waukesha itself. The relationship between the Metropolitan Church Association and the good people of the city of Waukesha was not warm and it was not friendly. Not at the beginning and not at the end. In fact, one could argue it became icier as time went by. And it was not because Waukesha was intolerant of religion. Waukesha had a rather interesting religious history of its own. It had welcomed a variety of religious denominations from its early years. And certain people in Waukesha had reputation as fine Christian public servants. Among those was the Justice of the Peace, or perhaps more properly referred to as the police judge or the police magistrate of the city, a man by the name of Eugene Wilder Chaffin. Eugene Wilder Chaffin served 2 terms in the position of Justice of the Peace, and he became one of the most famous local officials in America at the turn of the century. He had arrived in Waukesha in 1875, had settled in the area, had become an attorney, and eventually had run for the local judgeship. Upon being elected to the position, he announced that as a Christian gentleman and a member of a local temperance society, he could no longer tolerate the public drunkenness he had seen in Waukesha. He argued that benches and doorways and street corners were not proper locations for drunks. They were instead the rightful domain of tax-paying citizens. He rounded them up and threw them in jail. Apparently, the first sheriff, constable, or judge to ever think of doing such a thing. It didn't end drunkenness, but it did drive most of the drunks to Watertown and Beaver Dam. It ran them out of town. So impressed was the larger Christian community that Eugene Wilder Chaffin was asked to address lectures around the country. He spoke to women's suffrage organizations. He spoke at temperance rallies. And eventually, in 1908, he was nominated for the presidency of the United States by the Prohibition Party on an overtly Christian platform that rejected drinking and dancing and all sorts of other public carousing. He received 254,000 votes nationwide against William Howard Taft and got about 4% of the vote in Waukesha County. To this day, he remains the only Waukesha resident ever to run for the presidency of the United States. He ran again in 1912, receiving instead, this time, about 209,000 votes against Woodrow Wilson. Well, the fact is that he gave Waukesha a reputation nationally for Christian temperance. And it was a reputation that continued to attract Christian organizations to Waukesha. The Salvation Army arrived here in 1894. The Salvation Army is, of course, an English phenomenon, first and foremost. It was started in Great Britain by an English minister, a former Methodist minister by the name of William Booth, who had military proclivities. He loved 2 things, the gospel and his tin soldiers. He was fascinated with the military. He enjoyed reading books about ancient military campaigns, and he decided that he wanted to form an organization that combined his 2 interests, the gospel and the military. The result was the Salvation Army, which was organized in 1865. By 1900, it had been exported to the United States, with over 3,000 Salvation Army officers in North America and about 20,000 Salvation Army privates. They were warmly received in Waukesha in 1894. I mention that because they used the same ideology that the burning bush movement was later to employ. And I'll explain to you simply what that was. In order to live for God, you must separate yourself and live for God 24 hours a day. A Salvation Army colonel was never off duty. If you worked at the mission, you lived at the mission. If you worked with the poor, you lived in that neighborhood. You lived and worked with the people you served, and you didn't leave as you would punch out on a time clock and check out of work. It was a 24-hour commitment. The beliefs of Booth were that there had to be a movement to improve the world conditions in which we live. Booth rejected the idea held by some fundamentalist Christians that the world was going to get worse and worse and worse, and we simply had to wait for that to happen. He believed we could do something in the meantime. Now, that leads me to the concept of holiness. The burning bush movement was founded on the concept of holiness, an idea that comes out of the Methodist churches and also comes out of some Pentecostal sects as well. Holiness is an idea to perfect the individual Christian. It states, first of all, that that is possible. Some fundamentalists would disagree. Some mainstream Christians might disagree, but there is this firm belief that a higher level of perfection is possible on this earth. And this brings about something I promise I will not dwell on because it leads us far afield, but I need to note it. The concept of millennialism. Among fundamentalist Christians, and I use the term loosely, among those who were very strict Bible believers, let us say, there were several views of millennialism. There is premillennialism, which states that Jesus will return to earth in a second coming at a time when things get worse and worse and worse and worse, and when things can't get any worse, then he will return. And there is the other side of that coin, which is postmillennialism, which says that instead the second coming will occur only after a 1,000-year period of righteousness on earth. The kingdom of God will be established on earth, and the idea is that the kingdom of God can be established by those who seek it, by those who are, as we said earlier, the fair, the clear, and the terrible. Well, millennialism has a third component, amillennialism, and amillennialism is merely those who say, so what? We don't know if we're pre or post, and we're not going to worry about it. Well, the sect of believers who composed the Metropolitan Church Association were clearly postmillennial in their expectations. They were part of this holiness movement, which in their case emanated from the Methodist Church. Now, I should mention briefly that my grandfather and my great-grandfather were both German Methodist ministers. They would have found the holiness movement in their mind to be something of a heresy. The mainstream of the Methodist Church did find it so, which necessitated ultimately a split, a schism, if you will, between those who believed in the holiness ideal and those who felt that it was heresy to move in that direction. And ultimately, that's how groups like the Metropolitan Church Association were formed. They had their roots in Methodism, in Baptist groups, in Pentecostal sects, but ultimately they came to a parting of the ways with their mainstream church, and it was mutual. They wished to leave, often feeling persecuted, and the church felt they had gone down a path that the rest of the church could not follow. It would lead to a split. The holiness movement employed emotional summer camp meetings, going back to the old tent meeting that we associate greatly with the American South. Some movements which evolved or spun out of that include the Church of the Nazarene, started in 1908, the Pilgrim Holiness Church in 1897, and the Evangelical Methodist Church, founded even as late as 1946. So what about this Fountain Spring House? Well, as you know, it was at one time considered Waukesha's most beautiful hotel. And the photos we have here on the side wall attest to that. A beautiful building, a great part of the heritage of this city. It had originally opened as a hotel on July 4th of 1874, billed as the most fashionable resort hotel in the Northwest. There was a fire in 1878, after which the portion that burned was rebuilt. The architecture remained superb. The architecture was actually borrowed directly, in fact, from the Victorian style of the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga, New York. And that, by the way, is the reference point for calling the hotel and later Waukesha the Saratoga of the West. Many prominent visitors stayed at the Fountain Spring House, including some very famous people, some celebrities of their time. Other fine hostelries also abounded, many of them emphasizing health and building Waukesha's reputation as a health resort community. The Still Rock Spa in 1910, the Waukesha Springs Sanitarium in 1898, the Bethesda Sanitarium, the Moore Mud Baths in 1911, the Rest Haven Hotel in 1903, which of course, as you know, became the New Tribes property in 1958. But the old Fountain Spring House, the grandest old lady of them all really, began to fall on hard times. Reservations were declining by the time of the turn of the century. And the newer properties, which I just mentioned, ultimately overshadowed the old Fountain Spring House. The place closed for the last time after the summer season of 1905, and the property was put up for sale for $100,000, which, by the way, was listed at about 1/4 of its supposed actual value. 500 rooms, servant quarters, stables, 120 acres of land, quite a buy for $100,000. It stretched from College Avenue on the north down to present-day Newhall on the south, and was sandwiched in between East and West Avenues. Now enter the Metropolitan Church Association of Chicago, a group which purchased the property in late 1905 for $80,000. If the $100,000 was low, they were actually able to finagle the price down another $20,000 and purchase the property. Those listed as officers of that initial purchase were the Reverend Duke Farson of Chicago, a former bond salesman who the Chicago newspapers said was a multi-millionaire, F.M. Messenger, a former cotton mill manager who was also said to be quite wealthy, and Mr. and Mrs. Edwin L. Harvey, who were missionaries of the Methodist Episcopal Church and who had been responsible for the building of a Methodist church on Chicago Avenue down in Chicago back in 1894. They stressed an emotional style of worship at their church meetings, similar to the Southern Revival style of meetings, actually closer to a Pentecostal tradition than to traditional Methodism. Still, this was a uniquely American approach to religion born of the frontier. You don't find tent meetings in France. The mere fact that some of you smile at that is indicative of the fact that it's a uniquely American phenomenon. Although we might find some of these communal groups to be a bit strange, they are uniquely American in their origin, and they do share something in common with us in what they take from the experience of living on the soil of this land. The same sort of split that had occurred in New England Puritanism and in other faiths mentioned by me a bit earlier here had occurred in Methodism as well. And ultimately, the Metropolitan Church and Institute was chartered as a separate organization from the Methodist Church. By 1900, there was no further connection between the Metropolitan Church Association and Methodism, although the church would sometimes cite a connection to new recruits. The church itself claimed that they were truer to the teachings of John Wesley than was the mainstream Methodist Church, that they were closer to him in their devotion to the Scriptures, in their study of the Bible, and in their belief in the reality of the prophecies of Christ and the various prophets. They saw themselves as true Christians, and their goal was training ministers and missionaries. Well, the people of Waukesha heard via the Waukesha Freeman of the purchase of the property, and there was great interest in the community, including some level of concern. Was sale of the property to a church organization the best possible use that could be made of this once vibrant commercial property? They would soon find out. On Sunday, March 11th of 1906, the church leaders held a public meeting to announce their plans for the property. The public was welcome to attend. The meeting was actually a combination town meeting, press conference, rally, and religious revival, all rolled into one. Local residents attended, sitting gingerly in the back, while members of the flock from Chicago took up the first few rows. The Waukesha Freeman reported the meeting with evident amazement and some tongue-in-cheek amusement as well. The main speaker of the night was the aforementioned Reverend Duke Farson. Farson, I should say, by the way, in spite of being a millionaire bond salesman, was really very dedicated to the church and had given most of his personal fortune to the church. He was flat broke by about 1915. He preached holiness in his sermon that night. He preached the power of the Holy Ghost to wash men clean. And according to the paper, he said, quote, "Real religion consists of conversion and sanctification. It's like a double-barreled shotgun. The former is of very little use without the latter. Washed down of all meanness and wickedness, man is made holy. The Lord lives with him and walks with him." This holiness included no dancing, no popular secular music of the day, severe clothing, rejecting the fashions of the time, which after the turn of the century were becoming a bit more libertine, not only in the eyes of those in religious communes, but perhaps also in the eyes of grandma and grandpa as well. It wasn't so much what Duke Farson said, it was the way he said it. He said things that ministers in Methodist and Congregationalist and Presbyterian churches had preached from the pulpit in Waukesha already. It was his method of delivery that apparently set the people of Waukesha on edge. Waukesha was of a staid religious persuasion. Catholics, Lutherans, Presbyterians all got along well, and they sought to involve themselves in each other's business only insofar as they wished to make sure what their neighbor was doing. Other than that, religion seemed to be a personal and a private matter. They could best sum up their religious outlook by quoting St. Paul, who wrote in the letter to the Corinthians, "Let all things be done in their proper order." And there we have it, the fly in the ointment. That is the crux of the problem. Those traditional religious groups in Waukesha saw the Metropolitan Church as wild, as frenzied, as disordered, not doing things in their proper order, but doing them with robust emotion, not suitable to a solemn worship of God. In contrast, the Freeman reported that the members of the Metropolitan Church Association seemed to have no restrictions of those sorts. Freeman reported that those in attendance in the first few rows jumped on and off of their chairs repeatedly and frolicked in the aisles, quote, whooping like Indians, unquote. Not the way to conduct yourself in public, most Waukesha residents thought. Farson went further in his speech. He said that preachers should not even write down a sermon ahead of time, nor should they read a sermon from prepared notes. Simply stand before the people and let the Holy Ghost grab you. Well, that was, again, sort of foreign to many of those in the audience. The Freeman noted that the Metropolitan Church Choir, known as the Holiness Band, featured vocalists at the meeting, which sang hymns with, quote, gusto, unquote, but added somewhat sourly that all the songs seemed to have 17 verses apiece. The Freeman was making reference to a practice long popular in charismatic and Pentecostal circles, where the hymn is simply sung again and again and again and repeated until one is driven to a certain level of emotional frenzy. Very similar to even the chanting of a mantra in certain Eastern religions, where one will put oneself into a zone. The repeating of the verses of the hymn have a cumulative effect. The Freeman stated, quote, these people have remarkable length of wind and the utmost enthusiasm, every once in a while bounding up and down like a rubber ball without stopping to take a breath. They say their prayers the same way too, unquote. One can't help but believe that the Freeman reporter was having a bit of a good time in covering this meeting. He added later in his article that the response by the crowd to the hymns could best be defined, quote, as Indian war whoops and women shrieking in high C, unquote. Local citizens were horrified and walked out. Many heading probably for the nearest establishment which would serve them a bit of whiskey. Some more public-spirited citizens heading out to the outside corridors to try to determine how this could be stopped. And of course, it was too late. The Reverend Farson didn't help matters. When seeing the Waukesha residents walk out of his meeting, he rushed from the front of the room into the aisle, shaking his fist, and hollered after them, "Go ahead and leave. If you don't like our meetings, don't come. We didn't ask you to come anyway, and we don't owe you anything." Not what one would define as getting off on the right foot in your new city. The meeting resulted in a number of epithets in the local press, in both articles and letters to the editor. In the following weeks, the members of the Metropolitan Church Association were pummeled in local print as primitive, backward, ill-mannered, and wild men. But one name was used above all others, a name which stuck and which was greeted none too fondly by the members of the church: holy jumpers. As a recruitment effort, the Metropolitans began holding long and noisy street parades. They paraded behind the banner of the burning bush, and it was a banner showing a bush which was in flames and yet not consumed. Now, some of you may well remember from your Sunday school days of years ago the story of Moses and the burning bush. The story is, of course, that Moses on the mountain of God confronted a bush which was in flames and was yet not consumed. And the voice of God came to Moses from out of the bush and said, "Moses, remove your shoes, for the ground on which you are standing is holy ground." And Moses removed his shoes in awe and respect for the Lord. Well, the burning bush movement symbolized the fiery faith of the people of the Metropolitan Church, a fire that did not consume but was never quenched, a fire that did not destroy the bush but illuminated the bush with the power of truth. Hence the burning bush. Well, the burning bush parades were something of a nuisance. They apparently were a way to let off steam for those in them. It was rumored that members of the church were a bit reluctant to indulge overly much in carnal acts, even among man and wife. And some local Waukesha residents with a sense of humor said that this was just their way of working off the frustration. Doubtless that was not the case, although it was true that the Shakers designed their dances with stomping motions to do something of a similar sort. Well, the Metropolitans began holding these various parades as recruitment efforts through the streets of Waukesha. Parading down Main Street became a very popular activity of those in the church. In the street parades, they beat upon bass drums, they shook tambourines, they played clarinets and violins, and any other instrument which they could find, which often produced a rather odd combination of sounds when heard together, and at the same time shouted out gospel passages, sometimes shouting several at once as to make their comments almost unintelligible. They marched along with banners while passing out gospel tracts that they printed in their own print shop. The old hotel had undergone a remarkable change. It had been turned into a serviceable building with printing facilities, with a training center for missionaries and for ministers of the gospel. And it was really seen as much a factory for the production of God's work as it was seen as a place to live. Local residents complained about the parades, arguing that they should come under the heading of disturbing the peace. It all came to a head, however, on May 21st of 1907. A former reporter for the Waukesha Freeman, who some of you may remember well, Gib Koenig, wrote a column about this a number of years ago in which he reminisced about the day all of this had come to a head and told the story as only a great newspaper man could retell it. He based it on the clippings from the original paper, which you can, by the way, see on microfilm as well if you're of interest. But he sums the story up rather nicely also. It seems that during a particularly raucous parade on the 23rd of May, church members and young divinity students from the church apparently began shouting, leaping, and jumping into the middle of Main Street. Some of them whooping and hollering as they jumped across the street, scaring several horses that were nearby. Sheriff George Dwinnell arrested 17 for disturbing the peace. He sent them off to jail where they continued disturbing the peace. They refused to stop with a great uproar that continued through the night until the sheriff turned a hose on them to, quote, cool them down, unquote, and then refused to supply them with dry clothes or bedding. Supposedly, according to the sheriff, they had been leaping and hopping inside the jail cells, some of them leaping so high into the air that they banged their head on the ceiling of the cells. Along with that, they shouted chaotically. They sang, sometimes singing different songs all at once, and created a general din. Bail was set at $50 apiece, which all 17 refused to pay. They refused to post bond, saying instead they would stay in their cells for the required 10 days and they would fast and pray. Interestingly, after a 10-day fast, they had the nerve to accuse the sheriff of not feeding them. They were fined $2 apiece when their case came to trial, $2 a moderate fine for disturbing the peace, but they refused to pay, and on top of that, they sued the sheriff for mistreatment and false arrest. Civil trials were held, and during the civil trials, the presiding circuit court judge in the matter received a note from a Metropolitan Church member warning him that the plaintiffs in the suit were being guided by the hand of God, and he should watch his step. The judge took that as a threat, passing the note along to the sheriff, but the jury acquitted the sheriff anyway. The trials were at an end. The sheriff was found not guilty of the charges against him in the civil cases, and no award was made. The city council wasn't through with the matter, however. A city ordinance was subsequently drafted and passed by the Waukesha City Council banning, quote, shouting, jumping, or leaping in the city streets, unquote. Fines of $100 or 90 days in jail were to be assessed per violation. Do not ask me whether it was per leap or per incident. I do not know. But those who were caught leaping, jumping, or otherwise behaving inappropriately in the streets would be, in effect, ticketed. That ended the parades. There were no further Metropolitan Church Association parades through Waukesha, but it drove a permanent wedge between the Metropolitan Church Association and the community. There was never to be a close relationship after that. The relationship had not been close before this time, but it had often been cordial. It would cease after this time, and the group was viewed more and more as a somewhat annoying and perhaps even dangerous sect. They didn't use the word cult in those days. Had that word been extant in the popular vocabulary of that day, I've no doubt the people of Waukesha would probably have used it. The Metropolitan Church Association, meanwhile, went so far as to tell their children to refrain from leaving church property at any time. Even crossing the street to go to the other side of the street was frowned upon by the church leaders. The church leaders also considered themselves to be called out from and separated from the heathen at large. While upon their arrival in Waukesha in 1905-06, the members of the Metropolitan Church Association were willing to consider the Christians of Waukesha to be nominal Christians, backslidden perhaps, not fervent in their faith perhaps, but Christian nonetheless. By 1923, the Metropolitan Church was convinced they were surrounded not by lapsed Christians, but by heathens. The rift that developed was never healed. The city at large did not delve into the intricacies of theology There weren't enough people in Waukesha with theological training to have raised such terms as heresy. Instead, crackpot would be a more common designation. The church would respond with their own claims that those who were their enemies were in effect of the devil. Waukesha residents would no doubt have approved a move by the church, but that was not to happen. By the 1930s, the group had grown rather large and influential. In 1934, for example, 425 members were living at the Fountain Spring House as full-time residents. There were also ministers and missionaries in training living on the grounds. All had been given everything to survive in a communal sense on the property in order to further the work, and in return, they had given everything they possessed to the church. As a missionary endeavor, the church began holding meetings in other communities. In Milwaukee, for example. In the 1930s, they held several what outsiders might have called revival meetings, what the church actually called informational meetings in the Milwaukee area. In preparation of this assignment, I talked with someone who actually attended one of those meetings in the 1930s in Milwaukee. And they reported to me that it was, they were youngsters at the time, and they had gone more or less just as a lark to see what this was all about. But they became very nervous and frightened when once the meeting began, the ushers of the church went around and locked all of the doors, barring anyone from leaving the meeting hall once the meeting had commenced. My friend told me at that point, he said, it was serious business. Our smiles were gone from our faces, and we wondered not if we'd get home for dinner, but if we would get home at all. Needless to say, they arrived home later that evening, safe and sound. But it was this sort of tactic, which didn't seem to be all that unusual to the church leaders themselves, which always put them on the outs with the larger community. Things of this sort emphasized an image which a PR man would have told them to try to avoid. The church itself began to purchase property around Waukesha. They purchased 3 different farms on the outskirts of the city. They bought 185 acres on Highway 18 west of town. They also purchased another 30 acres next door, adjoining the Fountain Spring House. And they used the farms to begin to bring in money through the sale of crops and commodities. It didn't bring in a lot of money, but it did turn a profit, and the profit went into the communal treasury. Sect members did all of the work on the farms. They also operated the print shop themselves, setting the type, watching the machines, folding literature, stuffing envelopes, filling boxes with gospel tracts that were sent all the way around the world to missionaries literally everywhere, from Britain to India to China to the South Sea Islands. By their own estimation, over 1 million pamphlets and books were produced on site annually, which is a tremendous publishing and printing operation by anyone's estimation. Much of what they published were the tiny little gospel tracts, little 4 sheets, 2 sheets folded over. And the tragedy of it is, I suppose, for all their hard work, is that many of these were paper items considered very disposable, and very little of it survives. If you have a piece in a collection, it's a rare collectible. You can tell, by the way, because they would often list the source of the publication, so you would know if it was one. The church also founded an orphanage on their properties. The orphanage, of course, was part of the biblical admonition to take care of the fatherless and the widows, to take care of orphans, and it was also a recruitment effort. The orphans were to be recruited into the church, and they received training from the earliest days in all of their studies relating them to the doctrinal positions of the Metropolitan Church Association. Among the publications of the church was the Burning Bush. The Burning Bush is a newsletter, and it was published as an in-house organ, a party organ, if you will. It was not designed as much for the general public as it was for those who were part of the Burning Bush movement. In this particular one, which is a Xerox from December 28th of 1916, a very interesting story here. You'll remember that I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture that the founders, or the officers of the church at the time of their purchase of the Waukesha property in late 1905 were listed as Reverend Duke Farson, F.M. Messenger, and Mr. and Mrs. Edwin L. Harvey. Messenger and Farson were the two ex-millionaires. Well, the article here in the 1916 edition of the Burning Bush, which would be roughly 10 years after that purchase of the property, Edwin L. Harvey, editor of the Burning Bush and resident manager of our Bible school, has been indicted by a grand jury sitting in Chicago, Illinois. This is a body which listens to one side of a story. In this instance, it is a story made up by enemies of our work, who, upon swearing to distorted facts, have secured this action. The animus of this plot, instigated and abetted by F.M. Messenger and E.F. Derrick, formerly of the Burning Bush work, will be laid bare at the proper moment. There is a determined plan backed by abundant money to destroy the character and good name of our editor and thus embarrass the Burning Bush, which for years has fought hypocrisy and sham in religious circles. We ask our readers for their prayers, and we feel sure they will be interested in this trial as it progresses. This is another thing very common among communal movements. A lot of former friends, a lot of enemies who had been apart and had walked out with bitter feelings. Apparently that is the case here with Mr. Messenger, who was an officer of the church at the time of the Waukesha purchase, but now has left. Whether this was an attempt by Messenger to get some of his money back, or whether he had some problems with certain leaders of the church, it is known that the church became more dictatorial as time went on. More nuances, more habits, more patterns were dictated rather than being left up to the discretion or the peculiarities of the individual. After the 1930s and the early 1940s, the movement had clearly begun to decline. By the 1950s, the handwriting was on the wall. Their missionary work had been curtailed partially by World War I, by World War II, by increased tensions in the world. It wasn't as easy to simply send missionaries to unchurched areas of the world as it had once been. The church spent the fortunes of those who had given them everything in order to try to maintain their property, continue their publishing, and continue their educational and evangelizing activities. Still, very few new members were joining. The time for this movement had passed. The membership was declining rapidly, and as the membership continued its decline, a financial crisis inevitably ensued. Many others quit in disgust, walking out minus their assets, and those still there were now paupers. Having given their fortunes, they had nothing more to give. the property was becoming seedy and ramshackle. Once perhaps the most beautiful building in Waukesha, the property was now in its declining years. In order to save it, a great deal of money would have to be spent replacing the roof, replacing all kinds of deterioration in the wood. There was rotting of the wood on the sides. A new paint job was in order. A large property of this sort needs constant maintenance. And the church was simply no longer in a position to do that. The membership was aging, the membership was dwindling, and some new recruits joined more for the promise of a free meal than for the thought that they were going to do any real work once they got to Waukesha. In 1953, the Metropolitan Church Association sent a letter to the Waukesha School Board asking them if they had any interest in the property. It must have been a bitter pill to swallow. The Metropolitan Church Association ran its own schools on its property and had argued that the Waukesha public schools were not teaching the truth. And now they offered to sell the property to the public schools. To add insult to injury, the school board responded and said, "We have no interest in the property." Indeed, it had been allowed to become so run down that a good fortune would have needed to have been invested. Next, the Metropolitan Church approached the City of Waukesha and asked if they were interested in acquiring the property. The city could think of one good thing to do with the Fountain Spring House, and that was tear it down. But the city did not want the expense of tearing down the large, lumbering building that would be quite an effort and quite a strain on the municipal budget. So they in turn said they had no interest in acquiring the property because they could only imagine the property being utilized for one thing, and that would be utilization as a park. And to have a park, you'd have to clear the hotel and the other buildings that had also been built in the meantime, and there was no interest in doing that. There were problems in the neighborhood now, problems with rats. The Fountain Spring House had become infested with rats, and neighbors reported seeing them, neighbors who took pride in their own homes and were horrified by the rats that came and went from the dilapidated building. Clutching at straws, the executive board of the church decided they had one thing worth selling. They estimated they had about $30,000 worth of antiques that had been there since the days of the Fountain Spring House. Rocking chairs, mirrors, four-post beds, marble-top tables, mahogany bookcases, all were for sale at fire sale prices. An auction and sheriff's sale were organized in 1955 and 1956. After the auction of 500 pieces of furnishings, some of them dating back to the 1850s and 1860s, obviously already old when already extant when the Fountain Spring House had purchased them originally for their lobby and rooms. Wise buyers snapped them up. Someone here may have had a relative who was a wise buyer in 1956. By this time, 12 members of the sect remained in the Fountain Spring House, most of them staying in the buildings as watchmen, self-deputized to prevent youthful vandalism. There had been several attempts by young neighborhood boys to set the place on fire in the early 50s, all of which were fortunately averted. The leadership of the group, meanwhile, purchased 40 acres of land in Illinois for $240,000 on easy terms, and moved to the town of Dundee, Illinois, where they proposed to start a communal farm. After 1956, they were gone from Waukesha, and many people promptly forgot about them. They didn't stay in Illinois for long, however. They ultimately moved again, this time to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. They still had an organization in Lake Geneva in the 1980s. The group is still around today. I know that. In fact, they're having a convention or assembly this year, I believe, in Milwaukee. But it is an organization that looks past rather than ahead, back rather than forward. I started by mentioning the example of the monks in the East who had joined a monastery which is now ready to close. And in considering them again, and considering the members of the Metropolitan Church, one might ask what the remnant feels. I'm probably not obligated to try to do a deep study of that. In fact, it might be a disservice for me to try. But I think in all of these groups, they seize upon a shining moment. They see that there was a need, that they filled a need, they fulfilled a purpose, and just as the Lord inhabited their vessel, He's now moved on to inhabit another one. So I think these groups in many ways see themselves as a part of a continual flow and a process. Certainly the members of the Metropolitan Church were not upset by the fact that the world did not end. You must remember their millennial position. They did not expect a gradual worsening of world conditions and then a cataclysmic end of the world. They expected that they would be the holiness band who would bring about a new light movement in the same way that George Whitefield had tried to do in colonial times, and would eventually purify a part of the earth and make some people ready for the coming of Christ so that they could greet Him in robes of righteousness and not in rags of sin. There are other groups of that sort today. They preach the gospel of holiness. They hold in their hearts a hope that few of us can imagine. They remain outsiders, and I think both they and the world, underneath it all, prefer it that way. Thanks.